on the Jim Lehrer Evening News Hour. David Brookes and Mark Shields were his guests. And Jim Lehrer brought up the subject of the Iraq War. And here's what he said. Now that the Iraq War has come to a conclusion, what are your thoughts about it? Was it worth it in cost to Americans, first in terms of lives and money, and also, of course, in lives of the Iraqis? Mark Shields' response, according to the transcript of this broadcast, was as follows. No, it was not worth it. This was a war that the generals opposed. Generals like Brent Scowcroft and Anthony Zinni, Joe Corr, and Norman Schwarzkopf, and Eric Shinseki. People who had seen combat and tasted it. It was a war favored by civilians who had never experienced combat. Whether it was Richard Pearl, or Paul Wolfowitz, or Don Rumsfeld, or George Bush, or Dick Cheney. And the reality was that we went into the war under false pretenses. We went into a war that was not paid for. We went in for a war on a go-it-alone policy. And 4,500 American homes will not have a son, daughter, husband, or wife this Christmas, or any Christmas in the future, or see their children grow up as a consequence of it. And 33,000 are wounded, many in a disabling way. I think it's left us weakened. I think it's left us with less influence. And strategically, the greatest advantage has gone in that neighborhood to Iran, which now has an influence disproportionate to what it had before this war began. David, how do you see it? Yeah, I don't know whether it was worth it. The cost was obviously high in lives, treasure, and national morale. Personally, I am disappointed there was no mention of the tens of thousands of Iraqis whose lives were lost and the ruthless devastation that American bombs and missiles perpetrated against that country. To avenge the loss of 3,000 Americans on 9/11, we lost in addition 4,500 troops in Iraq and as well as 33,000 that were wounded. Who will stand and say, no more? Enough bloodshed. What will it take for Americans to cry out enough of building military forces, armaments, and killing machines? In his book entitled The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You, Leo Tolstoy says we need only make an effort of conscience to awaken, as from a nightmare to a different reality. Yet we find ourselves once again in December of 2011 with sabers rattling regarding the alleged development of a nuclear weapon in Iran. Will the American people be so moved by fear that they will succumb once again to the political rhetoric of the war propagandists and fearmongers? Why do they spread fear? Because governments know that fear works. They speak to our fears so that they can continue their violent and pernicious acts unhindered by the public that they are meant to listen to and to serve. And what is it that we fear? First and foremost, we want to be protected, so that they tell us if we are not willing to surrender our rights to privacy, for example in the case of wiretapping, they cannot get the intelligence they need about the enemy. And if they cannot get this intelligence, then they cannot protect us. And what's more, we are told that we are endangering the lives of our troops in the field. Fearful and readily, we succumb and enslave ourselves to this masterful speechifying. For those who speak out against these nefarious and non-transparent acts of our government, they are accused of being unpatriotic and that they do not support our troops. If citizens demonstrate in the streets, there is always the fear of being arrested and the fear of being beaten. Fear is the mind's nemesis, and it has been used by governments and the rich and powerful for centuries to keep the masses weak and compliant. Special interest groups and major corporations are the only ones who profit from war. These are the influential powers that really decide whether or not our sons and daughters are slain. What do the people get in return for the blood of their children? They get a lifetime of memories, regret, remorse, and the agony and emptiness of loss. They are told that their sons and daughters did not die in vain. They made the ultimate sacrifice. We, as a nation, are grateful to them. The tragedy of it all is that we believe these shallow words. They are shallow because even as the words are spoken, more and more of our children are being sent into harm's way. Fear among the electorate, combined with arrogance, money, and power, are the key elements that drive governments and politicians, like so many madmen, over the precipice and headlong into chaos, the chaos that is war. Iran, like Iraq, will be another war of choosing, but not a war of necessity. For those of you who are old enough to remember, it was fear of the spread of communism that got America involved in the Vietnam War. We lost that war, and it is a communist country today. That war cost America over 50,000 young men and women's lives and thousands wounded. Consider also the many thousands of Vietnamese who were killed and or wounded. We cannot allow ourselves to become so immune to pain and suffering that we do not recognize it in other human beings, even our enemies. Today, we trade with the Vietnamese. We buy their clothes. American tourists visit the tunnels of Cu Chi, the very tunnels in which their sons, daughters, and grandchildren spilled their blood and were blown to bits. All because of a president's fear of the spread of communism. Evil cannot stop evil. War cannot stop wars. Violence cannot stop violence. Nations have acted this way for centuries. The results are always the same. Human suffering is driven to the very brink